Hey, I'm Cedric Chambers, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of the 3D Podcast, a masterclass where we share with you everything you need to know about how to transform diversity and inclusion in your organization as well as in your community. We're on a mission to amplify the voices of leaders that are making an impact in the world today so that we can have a better tomorrow. Our goal every episode is to keep it simple, honest, and transparent with you by uncovering the truths in diversity and inclusion with the hope of creating behavioral change, all while presenting it from a unique perspective. So look, if you're ready, get your notepad out, pour you a drink, and let's dive deep as we discuss the dimensions of diversity. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the 3D Podcast, where we speak to real practitioners that are making real change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I'm excited for our show today as we are speaking to Lani Hall. Lani joins us with deep experience in diversity and inclusion, organizational development, and talent management. Lani spent 26 years at General Electric, repeating her success in developing and implementing diversity and inclusion and talent strategy to help business leaders improve performance at GE Energy and Power, GE Aviation, GE Capital, and GE Appliances. Lani has held various HR roles of increasing responsibility, gaining broad experience as organization and talent leaders, global diversity and inclusion leader, executive human resources manager, and global diversity, community engagement, and early career talent leader. Lani graduated from GE's prestigious Human Resources Leadership Program and rose to the top 1% of GE employees. I'm excited being a fellow alumni of the GE HRLP program to have this discussion with Lani, and I hope you're excited too. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Just to start off, could you share just a little bit about your background, kind of take us through your story a little bit, how you got into, diversity and inclusion, how you got into the consulting space, just so that we kind of get the frame of reference as we go through this discussion and our listeners can really get to see who you are.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you so much for inviting me on this to have this very important discussion. As you know about me, this is actually a labor of love. A little bit about my background. I was actually born in Japan and I'm African American. My father was in the military. And so I was born outside the country. I've lived on 3 continents and have really lived all over the world. And so from a personal standpoint, I've always had the opportunity to be around people that are different, where I was a unique person in the places where I was. From a professional level, I really got involved in diversity and inclusion when I joined General Electric, which I recently retired from a couple of years ago and started a consulting practice. And now I've gone back into the corporate world. But the opportunity that I had at GE to really be at the beginning of the journey of when we were starting ERGs and really expanding the story beyond traditional diversity and inclusion, but really thinking about diversity from the US standpoint, but also a global standpoint, because the company was very global, was where I got my start. And over the time, I had the wonderful opportunity of being the chief diversity officer for multiple businesses across multiple industries, in addition to other HR roles. And to the benefit of the diversity strategy in the company, I was able to rise to the top 100% of 300,000 employees as an executive of the company. And I got all of my learning and development from inside a GE. And the benefit of that was because GE was considered to be a standard bearer and really the best practice for all things diversity, I got an opportunity to talk with at least 100 companies over my 26-year career. So once I retired in the beginning of 2018, a number of those people came back and said, "Hey, we hear you're going to retire. Would you be interested in doing a project for us now that you no longer work at GE?" And I always knew that that's what I wanted to do in retirement. And so I started a consulting company. And of course, it was very busy during the time. It got even busier post the George Floyd incident. So I was working for small, medium, and large-sized businesses on diversity and inclusion initiatives. And I got a call where I thought they were asking me to do some consulting work because that's what I had been doing. And they actually were calling because they wanted to fill a role. And that's how I ended up in the role that I've been in now for about 5 months with J.M. Huber. And so it's an exciting opportunity to be here at a time when the history outside the company is very forefront in racial justice and systematic racism and all the things we're seeing. And so it's gone full circle from me being in Japan to me being here at this point in time and being able to take my personal story and my personal learnings and my professional learnings and blend it into having this discussion today.
No, that's awesome. I mean, Japan, 3 continents. That's amazing. Let me ask you this. Knowing that you have that background, you've lived in these different places, and also living in the US. Like, what do you see kind of as like your biggest learnings or some of the things that shaped you during that process of living in these different places to now in who you are today?
I think it shapes you whenever you have an opportunity to have different experiences, because that's what diversity and inclusion is about. And so you exercise this muscle where you actually become a little bit more culturally aware and culturally competent because you learn and live in those spaces and you get to understand. If you are open to it, you really get to understand life and values and customs and norms that are different in other places of the world. And so you learn about that and you lean into that. And so, being a child, it was very easy to lean into being the only African American family living in this little German village, where we had 5 girls at the time in the family living there. And that shaped then when I go to a place and I'm the only African American, I don't necessarily feel so subconscious because I've been that person many, many times in my life. I think that many people, if they took the opportunity to really go away from the fear and really get to know people, I think it shapes your ability to listen and hear and then develop a measure of empathy around those individuals. But we tend to fear what we don't know. And I think that drives a lot of the challenges and problems that we're having is because we're not having enough of those experiences with people to give us a different framework and a lens with which to look and interact with them.
Nice, nice. I kind of feel the same way. Just living, I believe we've lived in 4 or 5 different states and did a lot of moving as well. And just to be able to bring in those different experiences and then come back to where, in Georgia, where I'm from, it allows me to look at the world differently. And it allows me to look and experience certain things differently. Being in places to where I was probably the only minority, only black person. I've even had it to where we lived in a town to where it's probably less than 5 black people. And so, having those experiences and being able to kind of navigate through that, I think are very, very important. And so as we kick off the discussion today, we're talking about D&I programs and their impact as it relates to women of color. And, I'm excited to start the podcast off and to show off by, talking about, recently in the news, we've had Rosalind Brewer, who one has been a mover and shaker in her career, has been doing a lot of things. Currently, she is the chief operating officer at Starbucks, but recently just took the role of CEO of Walgreens, which will now make her the first, and well, not first, but the only African American woman currently CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And so, knowing that and kind of knowing the topic today, and you're hearing that news, kind of give me your thoughts on, Rosin getting into this role and kind of just overall, discussions that you've had and what does this mean?
I think it's phenomenal. I mean, go back to the, historic election that we've had with Kamala, who, by the way, went to Howard University, my school. Go Bison.
Oh,
And so incredibly proud, but it's a testament to all of the hard work of all the African American women and all the other people who have gone before them, who we all and they all stand on the shoulders of, and they would all tell you the exact same thing. I think the benefit of having the role models and have individuals see not only for African Americans, for other people who don't have an opportunity to have a daily interaction or interaction at all, they get an opportunity to see people doing things differently than what they might traditionally have been exposed to. And that's critically important. I know sometimes on LinkedIn, I saw a lot of people are posting the Rosalind Brewer story on their LinkedIn pages. It's the first of this, and there was another woman today. She's the first PhD in nuclear engineering. And a lot of times people in the comments say, why do you keep bringing up race? And why do you have to say she's Black? And why do you have to say she's a woman? And I think that's coming from a perspective of not understanding history and not understanding the importance of being able to have role models and to celebrate those role models. It's not negating or taking it away because they are something that's not the norm of what people are used to seeing. Is quite the contrary. I think sometimes people think that diversity is about squashing the differences and not ever talking about color and never talking about gender and race, but it's just actually the opposite. It's inclusion. It's leveraging that and bringing that story in, and it's okay to have that conversation and be able to talk about it. And I think, sometimes we think if we talk about it, then that means we're dividing people. And I think it's quite frankly the opposite. If we're talking about it and learning about it and experiencing it, we can leverage it to be better people.
No, I agree. And you talked about this. You talked about the historical piece there, and so just kind of taking this into a little bit deeper conversation here. When it comes to DNI initiatives, and we still see, where you have some companies who have, done well or excel, I would say, but it's kind of not the norm. And so when it comes to DNI initiatives, and we think about minorities, and specifically in this case, women of color overall, who has benefited the most from the D&I initiatives if you think about the last 15, 20, even 25, 30 years, and why, to help frame the reference of, where we are today?
I would say the data would show you it's definitely been white women as expected, and I'll tell you why it's kind of as expected. And then I would also say in the higher ranks, probably people that are Indian immigrants is what I would say. If you look at who's at the top of many of these companies, and
Yeah.
I don't think it's by accident. I mean, by nature, people have had more exposure. If I'm a person at the top of a company, as we see from the data, it's typically white male. Typically, the closest person to them would have been their mother or another white female. So it's not uncommon that because I have those experiences, I'm more likely to choose a person because I have a certain bias toward something favorably because that's what I'm exposed to. And that would happen with any of us. If you're exposed to something very favorably a lot, and it influences your ability to make decisions consciously and unconsciously. And I think that's what happens. So it's not a surprise that that's who's benefited the most because the people that are making decisions are really making decisions based upon familiarity and comfort. And so that then allows them an opportunity to see that person more. A long time ago, our chairman at GE at the time, Jeff Immelt, talked about these things called rings of familiarity. And he talked about, he said, as a white guy, the most familiar person in my circle, in my ring, is going to be a white woman. Then it's probably going to be a man, and then it's probably going to be a man of color because I was an athlete. And the person on my furthest ring for myself personally is going to be an African American woman. And I think that's what we see in corporate America. And he wasn't making a negative statement, he was making quite a positive statement to say. And so I make an effort to go to my furthest ring to get to know those individuals because I'm not going to naturally be able to do that in the spaces that I operate in. And so I think the reason you see that African American women and other women of color have not progressed is because we're not inside of that circle close enough to the rings of familiarity so that people can be comfortable with you, to understand you, to learn you, and to be close enough to grow and develop you. And I think you see that quite happen very often. And I think what we have to do is in those programs deliberately look for women of color and ask ourselves the questions: are we developing them at the same rate that we're developing other people in the organization? And we have to really be highlighting talent in that way because we're not going to naturally, the decision makers aren't going to naturally see them. They can be performing great and performing well and be in great opportunities, but someone has to see you and they have to see your performance in order to make a go or no go decision about where you go up the career ladder in an organization or, in a group.
No, that's a very interesting comment. And so just to stay there for a second, if we think about development, and so when we think about progression into roles, right? So when we think about Rosin Brewer and everything that she's doing, have done up until the point to now taking on the role at Walgreens, when we look at women of color, so why aren't women of color progressing into those VP, SVP, C-suite roles? And I want to note that there's been some recent studies out by McKinsey and Lean In that says that from progression for women of color, you have 6%, 5%, 3% respectively for VP, SVP, C-suite. And so what can we do to increase these numbers? One, from a talent development perspective, but then two, when we look at what's happening inside of these D&I programs that are actually holding women back, and how can we make sure that we're not implementing those different systemic or systems to prevent women of color from moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of the same thing. So I've done consulting with at least 100 companies of any company that you've talked to out there. I've been doing some consulting work with them or sharing some best practices at one point and also getting in to learn what they do. And what we find is typically when you're doing talent development and you use a definition, you say diverse or you say women. If you don't look at the intersectionality of not just women, but
Mm-hmm.
African American women, Hispanic women, Asian women, Native American, Indigenous, if you don't look at people in that way and really bifurcate your data, you're going to lump everyone in and not really see that you have challenges in those areas. And so I think going forward, there has to be a conscious decision by organizations to not just look at women, but really bifurcate the data and really get granular on which women. There's some other data that came out as well that I think the Catalyst organization had done that talked about women are not African American are not less ambitious, and all the data says, quite frankly, African American women are more ambitious than most other women. You wouldn't know that from who you see progressing in organizations. And so I challenge organizations to go back and really don't just look at women, but look at the intersection and the intersectionality of women in the organization, and not just put them all into one lump. Because if you do that, you might get some flawed data where you say, well, we're 75% women. Well, you might be 75% women or 30% women, but if you only have one African American female and one Asian, you're missing the boat on the talent that's available and out there. And so you have to go back to yourself and say, okay, what are we missing about that? And that not only goes for those C-suite positions, but also for board positions, the exact same thing. If you're looking in your search and you say, I'm looking for women, you need to specifically say, I'm looking for X women, and really be specific to the companies that are helping you source data about what you're looking for. You have to ask for it.
No, I agree. And so I guess the question is why, like, why do you feel or why do you think that, it is like when you hear about, even if it's ERG groups, right? It's like, the women's network. It's not anything that digs deeper into those different intersectionalities. Like why is that the case, right? Is it, I've heard of some notions that like if women win, then women of color you winning too, right? Well, but when that's not the case, especially when you look at salary data.
Yeah, because I think what we're doing, we're finally getting to the point where it's being called out. We have more data. So long ago, we didn't have people working in these data roles. I got a great friend named Serena, and she works at Kraft. And we've got lots of people out there that are data people, Nick Garbus. But these people are that understand data and able to look at it and use data to drive decisions. So if you only look at women, you don't know that you have the problem. I mean, you're talking about big and large organizations. People aren't seeing people in the hallways even now anymore because of COVID, but because they don't have exposure to these individuals. And many times, some women are in roles and positions that are not geared to the C suite organization. They're in roles that are not line roles, that are not operating roles. So they're not getting the experiences that allow them the opportunity to be able to be seen and evaluated. So, women don't get an opportunity those women won't get it. For all women, it's a problem, but then those women are not able to be seen by the organization. So when they're doing a talent review in the business and saying, who's our talent? There has to be someone in the room to say, I noticed that there are no X on this list. It seems like it's a really obvious thing to do, but it isn't obvious. I've been in rooms numbers of times. I've seen numbers of lists, and I said, did anyone notice there were no African Americans in this video? Did anyone notice that there were no women in the video? Or did anyone notice that there were women, but none of the women were talking? They didn't have a speaking role. And because of your experiences and because of how you learn and because of what you experience, you may not notice that. It's not a fault or anything that you have, but you just don't notice that. You don't see it. And if the person is open, they will say, oh, I'm glad you brought that out, Lani. I didn't even realize that the women were in the video. I didn't realize none of them were talking. Okay, I see what you mean. Let me try to fix that. Let's see what we can do. Or I realized we didn't have any women nominated to be on this special committee. Let me go back and look. You might be grabbing the data from different people in the organization. They can't see the total list, but if I'm in a position where I can see all the nominations coming in for an award, I should notice as a leader in the organization, and I have to be trained as a leader, or we have to have some processes that automatically ask the question, who's missing? Who's missing from this list? Do we have appropriate representation? And if we don't, we need to then back ourselves up and say, why is that? And what are we going to do to make sure that that does not happen again?
I agree. And let me ask you this question, touching on a little bit of that is that, when you think about development, when you think about putting women of color in roles to make sure that they can, one, get the exposure and put them in these growth opportunities. When it comes to the actual leaders, right, that are, head those organizations, which in a lot of cases aren't minorities, predominantly white. I've had conversations in the past, with leaders or with individuals, women of color, to where they struggle to get feedback. When they do get feedback, they'll get feedback from another leader in the organization that is black or a person that's diverse, because their direct manager didn't feel comfortable giving them the feedback who was white. And so when you have those type of situations, one, it takes a long time for that feedback loop to come around. But then, and that person could have done the same thing over multiple times, and it could have been detrimental to their career. But when you see that, one, have you seen it? And two, if you've seen it, How do you help leaders navigate through that space? Because that feedback is important, and we want to make sure that we're not losing that because we, feel uncomfortable having the conversations.
That is such an important conversation to have. That happens often. It's not just women of color or people of color. We see gender differences. We had done a study not too long ago where we looked at gender differences, and men told us they are uncomfortable telling women feedback because they're afraid they're going to cry. And they
Oh
themselves
yeah.
are not, trained that crying is okay. So if a person they assume that a woman is going to cry because the women they've been exposed to when they had a discussion with them cried, and so they assume the woman might cry if they have to tell them something tough. It's also a managerial issue because some leaders do not like to give feedback to men or women. So
Mm.
it's not even gender. They just don't like, most managers are not trained to deliver negative news. Everybody wants to deliver positive news. Nobody wants to go deliver negative news. Then they consider it to be negative instead of developmental, so it causes a limitation. Add on to that the cultural differences of what I may or may not know, and I'm conjuring up in my head what might happen. And so I just don't give the feedback. And then it becomes career limiting for the person because they're not getting actionable feedback. So I've coached many leaders about how to give feedback to a person, and not just how to give a feedback to an African American, but how to give feedback to anybody that has the right information and has the right level of data and examples so that the person can make an actionable plan that you both can have a commitment to seeing that development happen. So that's a big issue. Lots of companies and lots of people will tell you they do struggle with giving feedback negative, but even if it's someone that's different, they are not sure, especially African American women. They have this, there's a stereotype that's out there that we have to face into, that African American women are going to, be that angry black woman that they see on a
Yep.
television show, or
Mhm.
African American men are going to be the angry black men that they see in some, situation. And so people don't have enough exposure to know that those are stereotypes. Even though if they haven't faced them, they see them, and that's gotten to their psyche, into their subconscious, and that then makes them behave differently when it comes to giving the feedback. So we as HR leaders and other professionals who have competencies in this area, and as leaders, have to coach leaders about how to get over that, and have to practice and role play and show them how it's done.
No, I agree. I agree. Look, being inside of, as you know, GE, and not being inside of GE and looking at other organizations, and we talk about not being coached to deliver feedback. To be honest, most managers aren't coached to be managers or leaders, we could say, right? It's almost like you've done a great job and you get put into the roles.
Yeah, we had a great discussion with the Women's Network. We've had this evolving discussion we were having about when you have these women organizations not letting men be included. And I've been a proponent of having men included in these organizations. It's a both and strategy. You have things that you do with just women, but you need a both and, because if 90% of companies are run by men, women are going to be getting promoted by men until
Yep.
something changes. Therefore, you need to bring men into the discussions, and to learn and to listen and to share so they can grow and develop and exercise their muscle. Because if you keep people separated, they're never going to have an opportunity to really hear the stories and hear what they can do differently. You have a lot of men who are more than happy to do this. Someone asked me on a panel recently, do I think that the Me Too movement caused men to not want to be alone with women in the room? And I said, quite frankly, any man that tells me that because of Me Too, he no longer wants to be in the room with women, he had a problem before Me Too.
Yep. There you go. There you
So
go.
that should not be an issue. What you should be
Exactly.
doing is looking at your skill and ability to coach, to provide feedback, to manage, to lead any of your talent. I do think that we do have to think about how we're teaching men in some spaces, especially technical men. So if you're a technical man, sometimes, and this is not everyone, so I don't want people to call you and say, you said this was everyone. It's not everyone. But what I am saying is, even for technical men who might even be more technical, we found in the data that technical men even had a harder time doing this because they weren't in school to study how to be a manager. They were in school in how to be the technologist that they are. And now they become a manager. And so there's a skill gap between managing people and giving feedback, because that's not how they were developed when they were in school.
I agree. I agree. I mean, being, HR leader for technology, a lot of the technology leads that was very, very technical. The only reason they really wanted to manage was to control the resources on their projects. It wasn't even about management. It was just, I know I can have these resources. And so when you think about that, right, that next level of how to lead, how to have conversations, how to go down these paths and really grow a team is just not there. As we look, just kind of coming to the end here, just a couple of last questions I want to ask. One, as it relates to, we've broken down the overall bucket women of color into just say women, but when it comes to dividing it out, you say, white women versus women of color, or what can white women do in this process to help women of color as they navigate through organizations, as they navigate through their careers?
Some people say be an ally. I said, nope. They said, some people say be an advocate. I said, nope. You need to be an agitator.
I like that.
No more ally, no more advocate. You need to agitate. You need to, when you're sitting in the room, say, what about that talent? You need to agitate and ask the questions and pointedly say, I am talking about women of color. I am talking about African American women. I'm talking about Hispanic women. You have to bring it up. That is the responsibility, I think, of white women who have a seat at the table to be able to say that and do that. They have to consciously make a conscious decision to agitate.
I love that word agitate. I'm gonna start using that. When it comes to kind of the last piece here, if we think about listeners, they're hearing this discussion and they're trying to see, a lot of things that we spoke about, what can they take back and start to put into action tomorrow at their organizations? Understanding that, what are 3 actions that either, leaders or organizations can take to improve the success of women of color in their organizations?
In the development plan, when I'm doing my consulting and even in my day job, the first thing you need to do is you need to sit down and have what are called get to know discussions of your talent. You can't promote people you don't know. So there's a format and structure you can use called a get to know. Sometimes they're called stay interviews, but sit down and get to know your talent, get to know their skills, their hopes, their dreams, abilities, what they're doing in terms of development. Help sit with the organization, determine whether the destination roles they have the capability to go to, and develop them. So once you get to know them, you can determine whether or not they need continued mentoring or they need sponsorship. Mentoring would be a first step, sponsoring would be the next step. Eventually, you want to get to the point where the people whose opinions matter know this talent, and the people whose opinions matter that can make a go or no go decision, that's sponsorship. And so you want to make sure you get individuals from known to sponsorship, and you're putting those formal processes in place where you're either quarterly or once a year or twice a year, however often you need to do it, to go back and check on fully functioning development plans on people that you think have the capacity to be in the organization at a higher level, and make it a routine operating review and an operating structure, just like you do anything else. Financial meetings, you should be having talent reviews. If you have an ops review, you should be having an operating talent review to talk about that talent. So those are, things that you can do. You can get to know them, you can mentor them, and then you can sponsor them, and you can have regular talent reviews to talk and review where that talent is.
No, awesome. Awesome. I like that. I like it. And so, this has been an amazing conversation. Look, before we go, do you have any shout outs, any parting words? And then also, if people want to, get to know you more and dig into kind of your thoughts and your practice, where can people find you if they would like to connect with you?
They can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm there. I haven't putting a lot of posts up lately because I've been so busy with so many other things, but I'll always forward
Good
stories
thing.
and content that I think is something that I want people to pay attention to. And I'll put a note and say, hey, here's a great job opportunity for a great leader that I've worked with. And these are all going to be personal people that I know are talented, that I think people should look at their opportunities for. And then if I think there's some rich content from a development, I posted one today about how what the GE history in Africa is a lesson to all companies about how employee resource groups, ERGs, can help fuel the business. GE is an over $5 billion business in Africa because of the GEERG, the African American Forum. So I'll put content out there like that. But if you follow me on LinkedIn and reach out to me, I'm more than happy. And then if there are companies that you need to do work with and you want to work in this diversity space, I can give you a referral of some great consulting companies that do the same work that I do, that I've worked with myself, that can help you shape and inform you about these topics and areas.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, look, Lani, I want to thank you for joining us today on the 3D podcast. Look, I wish you much success in your future endeavors, and I can't wait to for the listeners to hear this episode and to get the feedback. I hope you have a great one, and we'll talk soon.
And thank you, Cedric. This was such an enjoyable discussion, and I'm happy to talk to you anytime, of course, and catch up.
Oh, that's always great.
Have a great one.
You too. Awesome. Well, that does it for us. Thank you for joining us on another episode of the 3D Podcast. If you would like to connect on social media, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Cedric Empowers. And if you have any questions you'd like me to read or answer on the show, or just want to know more about my thoughts around diversity and inclusion, entrepreneurship, or just overall business, you can text me. Yes, I said text me at 770-285-0404. You'll receive content straight to your phone on a regular basis, and you can message back and forth with me, not a bot or an assistant. All responses come directly from me. Well, look, this has been a great episode. Until next week, this has been Cedric Chambers, and you have been listening to the 3D Podcast. We out.